Shalom, and welcome to V'ahavta Yisrael, a Hebrew phrase which means, you shall love Israel. We hope you'll stay with us for the next 30 minutes as our teacher, Dr. Baruch, shares his expository teaching from the Bible. Dr. Baruch is the senior lecturer at the Zera Avraham Institute based in Israel. Although all courses are taught in Hebrew at the Institute, Dr. Baruch is pleased to share this weekly address in English. To find out more about our work in Israel, please visit us on the web at LoveIsrael.org. That's one word, LoveIsrael.org. Now, here's Baruch with today's lesson.
Well, the scripture that we're going to be studying tonight is primarily a list of 112 cities that comprise the allotment of land that God gave to Judah. Now, we need to understand what is being said in this distribution of the land. We've learned that it's a distribution by goral, by lot, meaning people don't choose, but people are receiving the will of God, what God has for them. So it's not making requests, it is not petitioning God, it is receiving and recognizing His order, His purposes, His ways for building up His kingdom. And that is a wise truth, that if we want God to work in our life for a kingdom purpose, then we need to submit, we need to seek His revelation, we need to agree with His order, His timing, everything needs to be brought under His authority. That is a good thing, and when we do that, we are inviting joy into our life. Being in the will of God, the outcome of that, it produces joy, contentment, an inward peace, and assurance. It deepens our understanding of God. Now, we began this chapter last week. We read and studied the first 19 verses, and we saw the borders, but now in this second part of chapter 15, we are going to look at cities. Some of these cities, just like we saw last week, some of these places we know. They exist, and they exist in the same location or very near the biblical location. They were named in memorial to the history. Other places, and several of them, we don't know. Now, you may go in the general area today. There are certain cities and certain descriptions here that can bring us into the general location. And there will be these names, but they're not necessarily in the precise, the exact location of where they were previously. Some are, some aren't. Now, this is the distribution of the tribe of Judah. God has an order. He has began with the allotment of the land, the inheritance for Reuben and Gad and the half-tribe Manasseh. I say half-tribe because Joseph, a full tribe, was broken down into two tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh. So we saw that Manasseh, that he received in that same area on the east side of the Jordan River where Reuben and Gad also received. We came to a conclusion 2 weeks ago of that eastern portion, the tribes, the 2.5 tribes that were there. And now we're going to focus in on one tribe, the tribe of Judah, on the western side of the Jordan River. And we know from history that southern portion of the land of Israel became, after the division of the monarchy, when Solomon died, there was a division. And we see that there's the southern kingdom, which was called Judah because most of this land of the southern kingdom belonged to Judah. And there's that northern kingdom that was called Israel, also known by the name Ephraim. because Ephraim has significance in its meaning and its purpose. We'll talk more about that when we deal with that allotment to Ephraim. But here, there's one thing that I want us to realize. In that southern allotment of land to Judah, that key city, and we mentioned this last week, that key city is, of course, Jerusalem. And what I'm going to do as we turn our attention to our study time, we're going to begin in verse 20 again. Yehoshua, Sefer Yehoshua, the book of Joshua, chapter 15, and we're going to begin where we left off in verse 20. And we're going to read very briefly verses 20 through verse 63. Now that's a lot of verses, but we're simply going to read them. There's not going to be much teaching or much commentary from these verses, so we're going to have a brief time tonight. But I do want to make mention of one verse and spend some time there. Look with me to the very last verse of chapter 15. So we'll come back to that in our reading, but I want to begin, before we read, I want us to look at this last verse, verse 63. Now, what's going on? We're going to read a list of places, things that give us a description of where we're talking about, and the cities that belong to this geographical designation. But we're going to see that within these places that are mentioned, there's 112 cities spoken of, one of which is Jerusalem. And notice what it says concerning this, verse 63. V'et ha-Yebusi. Now, Yebusi is where we get the term Jebusite. And what's interesting, it's singular. We sometimes will say the Jebusites, but when we look at it, Yebusi in Hebrew, we're talking about a people. And what God is saying is that the Jebusite people, ha-Yebusi, that were dwellers of Jerusalem, they dwelt in Jerusalem. Notice, Bnei Yehuda, the children of Judah, they were not able, lo yachlu, to inherit them. So the whole verse. And the Jebusite people, the dwellers of Jerusalem, the children of Judah, were not able, they were not able to take possession of them. Now, this is important because we see here initially, Jerusalem was not captured by Joshua. And notice what it says when this is recorded in the verse 63. And the Jebusite people, they dwelt with the children of Judah in Jerusalem unto this day. So we see here that Jerusalem wasn't fully controlled by the children of Judah. There was a sharing, but Israel, the people of God, did not have control of it. Now, why is that important? Well, as I shared with you, this distribution of the land has some kingdom implications. What does that mean? It means that we can look at this distribution of the land in Joshua and learn things about the last days. And what that tells us is this: in the last days, Jerusalem is going to be a divided city. We are thankful, it tells us in the prophecy of Zechariah, that even though there's going to be many from Jerusalem who flee because of the Antichrist's attack on this city, this is going to be a persecuted place. Why? Well, understand the reason why. There's going to be an event in the middle of Daniel's 70th week, those last 7 years at the midpoint. That event is called the abomination of desolation. Now, even though the Antichrist empire is going to be in control of all the world before the abomination of desolation, and the Antichrist is going to be ruling. But hear this, and this is where there's a lot of confusion. His revealing in a dominant way that he, without any doubt, that this is the Antichrist empire and he is the Antichrist, that revealing of him with assurance is going to be in the middle of Daniel's 70th week. When I said the revealing of him with assurance, we can be assured one who does this act is indeed the Antichrist. We are assured this is him. And what is that event? I shared that. The abomination of desolation. Now, we know something. That abomination of desolation is when, we learned this from Daniel, in Daniel chapter 11, primarily verse 36, and also by the Apostle Paul in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 4, where it says, and the context is his revealing. He is going to go into the Holy of Holies. Your Bibles will say the temple, but it's a word more precise, the Holy of Holies. We're speaking about neos in this form, neon, which is the sanctuary, the holy place, the most holy place, the Holy of Holies. And what's he going to do there? He's going to take a seat. Paul says he's going to sit there, proclaiming himself to be God. And what's going to happen? Well, obviously, believers, we're going to be opposing the Antichrist, his deceit, his unrighteousness. He's also called the man of lawlessness because he is categorically opposed to the Torah. What's the Torah? Love and righteousness. That's what the Torah teaches us. How to love one another and how to love God and how to live righteously. That is the truth that the Torah mediates to the one who studies and applies the Torah, its truth, its commandments to our life under the leadership of the Holy Spirit. As Paul says, he who walks not in the flesh but in the Spirit fulfills the righteousness of the law. That's your calling and mine. So under the leadership of the Spirit of God, we can implement Torah truth into our life in a new covenant manner that manifests righteousness and also reveals God's glory. That's a good thing. So we see that in the last days, Jerusalem is going to be a divided city. There's going to be many who leave it, but it says, a remnant of that city, the inhabitants are not going to be cut off. There will be, up until the very end, and we're talking about now, the second coming, there's going to be a remnant of Jewish people in Jerusalem during all, hear this, all of Daniel's 70th week. But what we know is that it's a contested place. And that's the message here in Joshua 15 and verse 63, that it is a contested place. There's the Jebusites and the Israelites, or in this case, representing all of Israel, the tribe of Judah, contesting. Look again, verse 63. And the Jebusite people, the dwellers of Jerusalem, it says, the children of Judah were not able to take possession to inherit them, rule over them. And therefore, what do we see? The Jebusite people with the children of Judah dwelt in Jerusalem until this day. And the good news is this foreshadows a future victory, where we're going to see that only new covenant people ultimately in that new Jerusalem, on day one, only new covenant people will be there. Those who are part of the church, we are going to be ruling and reigning with Messiah, participating in his leadership. And then Israel is going to be the leader of the world. And there's going to be nations, those nations that were left by God and that witness God's victory. They're going to be called up to Jerusalem. For specifically, it says in Zechariah 14, I believe all the festivals will be embraced and observed in the millennial kingdom. But Zechariah simply mentions the Feast of Tabernacles, Chag HaSukkot, as the nations having to demonstrate their trust, their dependence, their reliance upon God, their faith, and they're going to have to come up to Jerusalem. So it's going to be a city that shows and manifests the submissiveness of the people to the king. Well, we see here that the Jebusites, just like the Antichrist people, are not wanting to submit, not wanting to participate in the plans of God. Now, one last thing before we read, and that is this. There is significance in the fact that Judah is being given the land, called to take possession, and what places specifically, first, before any other of the other tribes on the west side of the Jordan River. Judah takes precedent. Why? Because Judah is the messianic tribe. The Messiah comes from there. So with that said, let's take the last few minutes. As I said, we'll have a brief time tonight. We're simply going to read carefully verses 20 through 63 of Joshua 15, and then we're going to conclude. And I want to point out that in Hebrew, we have the word frequently and. In English, most of your Bibles will not have that redundancy. They'll put a comma until the last one, that last part of the verse, the sentence. But since I'm looking and translating the Hebrew, I'm going to say each time that the word and appears, because it's scripture, I'm going to say it. Now, there's another uniqueness of Hebrew. Some things are called cities, places with the definite article. Others are not. That definite article is the word the, in Hebrew, ha. So there are times that it appears and times that it does not. Most of the time it doesn't, because the name itself makes it definite. So this is just some idiosyncrasies of the Hebrew language. So be aware of that. When you hear the term ha at the beginning, it's that definite article that is included in this naming from the Word of God in Hebrew. Let's begin. Joshua 15, beginning with verse 20. This is the inheritance of the tribe of the children of Judah for their families. So it's an inheritance. I've mentioned, it's interesting. There's a word shevet for tribe and mate, both meaning more or less the same thing, but mate can also be a place that represents leadership. So this is for the leadership of the tribe of Judah, for them to hear what God is telling them to take possession of and rule over. So perhaps one explanation why mate instead of shevet is used here for tribe. Again, verse 20. This, and the word zot, it's feminine. When it stands alone, it usually stands alone to emphasize, to say this is the primary thing. And that's what we're talking about, the primary cities that comprise the land that God gave to Judah. This is the inheritance of the tribe of the children of Judah for their families. Verse 21. And they shall be the cities. So it introduces it with the verb, they shall be. What should be? These cities that are going to be mentioned. And this is of the most outmost place of the land. It's dealing with the borders and the primary cities within these various allotments of land in the inheritance of Judah. So we're talking about the end places, the extreme places, the outermost places for this tribe of Judah. And it says the tribe, or literally the sons of Judah, for the border, and we talked about this last week, the border, and this would be on the east, the border Edom, that's in the south. So it goes, Edom's in the east, but we begin in the very southeast of this allotment of land. And it says here what the cities are: Kavtsa'el and Ader and Yagur. Verse 22. Additional cities are included in this area: and Kina, and Dimona, and Ad Adah. Verse 23. And Kadesh, and Chatzor, and Yitnan. Now, pay attention, because this place, Chatzor, is going to be mentioned 3 times because it was a key city. We saw this earlier on in our study of Joshua. A key city for them to take. So many things are referenced in light of this city, Chatzor. Now we're ready for verse 24. Ziph, and Telem, and Vealot. Verse 25. And Chatzor, Chadata, and Kiryot Chetzron. And it tells us Kiryat Chetzron. It is Chatzor. So 3 times we see that Chatzor is mentioned as part of this land. Now, Chatzor, we're talking about not that key city in the north, but rather another Chatzor that's in the south. But it's mentioned 3 times to show its significance, its relationship. Do we know where that is today in the area of Judah? We do not. But apparently it had great significance. Verse 26. Amam, and Shema, and Moladah. Verse 27. And Chatzar Gadah, and Cheshmon, and Vet Pelet. Verse 28. And Chatzar Shu'al, and Beer Sheva. Beer Sheva, of course, is today the capital of what's called the Negev, the southern part. It's one of the largest cities in Israel. So this place was known, is known. Many will say that where it is today may be somewhat different, a few kilometers away, but nevertheless, it is in that tribe of Judah. Also, Vizyotnya, verse 29. Baalah, and Iyim, and Atzem, verse 30. And El Tolad, and Kasil, and Hormah, verse 31. And Ziklag, and Madmana, and Sana, verse 32. And Levaot, and Shilchim, and Ain, and Rimon. Now notice the end of verse 32. This is the first allotment of cities in that geographical location that he's speaking of in the southeast. And he says, therefore them, end of verse 32, all the cities that we've mentioned, and you can count them up, 29, and the next word is the word Chatzer, which is like a courtyard. Some will say it's villages, but it's not the normal word for village, but rather it may be speaking about, and their places of administration. So this is probably the best way to understand this term that's going to be repeated Also, their places of or for administration. Now let's look at verse 33. Here we're talking about another area of land. It's called the Shephelah. The Shephelah is not on the southeast, but it's on the southwest. And it's in the area where I live. I live in the Shephelah. So it's the lower coastland close to the Mediterranean. Verse 33. In the Shephelah, the lower coastland, the first city, Esh Ta'ol, and Tzor'ah, and Ashna. Verse 34. And Zanoach, and En Ganim. Now, Ein, this is En, but this term Ein can be a well. Ein and I, as we came across that word, but here when it's En, it's referring to the well of Ganim. Verse 35, the end, Tapuach, and Ha, here's the definite article for this place, Ha Enam. Verse 35. Yarmut and Adulam, Socho and Azekah. Verse 36. And Sharim and Aditaim and Ha Gedera and Gederotim or Gederotaim. The cities, how many cities in the Shephelah were mentioned? We have 14 cities and their places of administration, their courtyards. Verse 37. Tzanan and Chadashah and Migdal Gad. Verse 38. And Dil'an and Ha, again, the Mitzpeh. Mitzpeh is a city that's elevated. It means a lookout or a city that was used for a lookout. So it's called Ha Mitzpeh. And the end of verse 38, and Yaktael. Verse 39. Lachish and Batzkat and Eglon. Eglon we've also mentioned several times in our study in the last few weeks. Verse 40. And Kabon and Lachmas and Chitlish. Verse 41. Gedorot and Bet Dagon and Naamah and Makeda, another city we've mentioned several times. 16 cities and their courtyards. Verse 42. Livna and Ater and Ashan. Verse 43. Vayiftach and Ashna and Netziv. Verse 44. Keilah and Achziv and Ma-Resha. 9 cities and their places of administration, their courtyards. Verse 45. Ekron, and we have a term, the daughters, its daughters. Now, these cities were presumably more of a major habitation. So we have its cities and also its daughters, which probably mean smaller, not cities, but smaller towns. Now, here again, in this time, what we consider a city, these may be much smaller, but they were known. They were cities of administration, what we call an area, a district center. But there was also smaller towns or villages around it, and this is what the term banot, daughters, means. So Ekron, and we would say her towns. City is a feminine word, so it's her towns, or its towns, we could say, and its courtyards, meaning its places of administration. Verse 46. And from Ekron and Yamah, all which is near to Ashdod and their places of administration, courtyards. Now, remember, we are in this area. Now we're talking about further southwest, very close on, we might say, the Mediterranean Sea. Ekron, and then we have Yama, which is towards the water, literally the sea, and all which is by Ashdod. Ashdod was a major city, and it's where I'm speaking to you from now, and its courtyards. Verse 47, because of its significance, just like what we saw with Chatzor, it's also mentioned again. Verse 47, Ashdod and her towns, meaning her daughters, her other places of significance, and her courtyards, places of jurisdiction, perhaps courthouses and such. And within this area, we have Aza, which is the Hebrew way of saying Gaza, so we know exactly where Ashdod is, and Ekron, and Gaza, and it says also her towns and places of administration, its courtyards. Unto, notice this, we're at the very, very south, where it says, Ad unto Nachal Mitzrayim. This is what many Bibles call the brook of Egypt. It's simply a word that speaks about a wadi or a dry riverbed. And this was well known. It's part, and we mentioned it last week and we mentioned it this week. It's the southernmost border for the land of Israel that God promised Abraham. Verse 47 at the end, the border of the sea, this big sea and its border, meaning that we have the brook and the Mediterranean forming that border at the southwest. Look now to verse 48. In verse 48, we're not dealing with the southeast, which is very deserty, but we're not dealing with the southwest, which is coastline and a plain. But now in verse 48, it says Uvahar, and in the mountain, and here it means in the mountainous area. Read. And in the mountainous area, we have Shamir and Yatir and Soho, verse 49, and Dana and Kiryat Sana. And this town, Kiryat Sana, is also known, and we've come across this place much, the town Devir, verse 50. And Anav and Eshtemo and Anim, verse 51. Goshen and Holon and Gilo, and then we have 11 cities and their courtyards, their places of administration. Now, Goshen and Holon and Gilo, all places that are used today, whether it's an identical area, this is debatable. Verse 52. Arav, Duma, and Eshan, verse 53. And Yanum, and Vet Tapuach, and Afekah, verse 54. And Humta, and Kiryat Arba, it is Hebron, and Seor. How many cities? 9 cities. And their courtyards, their places of administration. Verse 55. Maon, Carmel, and Ziph, and Utah. Verse 56. And Yisrael, and Yokdeam, and Zanoach. Verse 57. The Kain, Ha-Kain, there's that definite article again. Giv'ah and Timnah. 10 cities and their courtyards. Verse 58. 58. Chalchul, Bet-Sur, and Gador. Verse 59. Ma'arat and Bet Anot and El Tekon. How many cities here? 6 cities and their courtyards. Verse 60. Kiryat Baal. This is Kiryat Yarim. And today we know where Kiryat Yarim is. It is west, about 12 kilometers west of Jerusalem on Highway 1. So known places, and still, of course, in the allotment of the land of Judah. So look again at verse 60, Kiryat Baal. This is Kiryat Yarim. And again, that definite article, Rabbah. And these cities that are mentioned, it says 2 cities and their courtyards. Now verse 61. Now we're dealing with the desert area, not as far south as we did earlier in the first part of our study tonight, near Edom. We're closer now to the Dead Sea, where it says, in the desert or wilderness, Bet HaArava. And today we speak about the Arava, and it's the land, once you go south quite a bit of past Beersheba, as you move eastward, you come into the Arava. So this is in the desert area, and it's a desert, Bet HaArava, the desert plain, and Midin, and Sachacha, verse 62. And the Nivshan. So another town with that definite article leading up to it. Nif'an. And Ir Hamelach, and the salt city. And right by the dead city, we have En Gedi. Verse 62 at the end, 6 cities and their courtyards. Altogether, if you add up all of these, you get 112 cities. Last verse, we studied this earlier at the beginning, but I'll read it again. V'et ha-Yebusi, Yoshvei Yerushalayim, lo yachlu v'nei Yehuda le-horisham. Vayeshev ha-Yebusi et b'nei Yehuda b'Yerushalayim ad hayom hazeh, which means, and the Jebusite people, dwellers of Jerusalem, the children of Judah, were not able to take possession of them, inherit them. And the Jebusite people, they dwelt with the children of Judah in Jerusalem unto this day. Well, we'll close with that until next week when we press on and we deal with the allotment of Ephraim, which is north of Jerusalem. Until then, may God bless you. Chag Sameach, that special holiday that begins on Sunday night and Monday. Shemini Atzeret, that 8th day assembly. Until next time, shalom.
Well, we hope you will benefit from today's message and share it with others. Please plan to join us each week at this time and on this channel for our broadcast of LoveIsrael.org. Again, to find out more about us, please visit our website, LoveIsrael.org. There you will find articles and numerous other lectures by Baruch. These teachings are in video form. You may download them or watch them in streaming video. Until next week, may the Lord bless you in our Messiah Yeshua, that is Jesus, as you walk with Him. Shalom from Israel.